former abbey church of Saint Philibert at Tourneux on the Saône River in Burgundy, and it was begun just about the year 1000. Back in the 1920s, Charles Homer Haskins wrote a famous book called The Renaissance of the 12th Century, in which he argued that the real break with the Dark Ages came not around 1400 with the Renaissance, but around 1100 with what are now called the High Middle Ages. In fact, something happened a century before that which might indicate an even more obvious break with the darker past. The wave of what we might call, without being misleading I think, Christian energy that swept over Europe in the High Middle Ages really began just about the turn of the millennium. For example, if you were to count the buildings erected in the 150 years before 1000, which are still standing, and compare that number with the number of buildings erected between 1000 and 1150, which are still standing, you would get, although this is just a ballpark figure, a ratio of something like 1 to 1000. A comparable ratio for the number of works of sculpted figures would be perhaps 1 to 10,000. This kind of arithmetic can be misleading, but I do think this claim can be defended. At the least, the 11th century was very different from the 10th. The architectural style which comes after Carolingian in art history books is the Romanesque, and Tourneux is often considered pretty much where the style begins. One thing that distinguishes the Romanesque style from, say, Carolingian buildings is just size. True, we know there were some big Carolingian churches, like the one at Saint-Hilaire, Cathedral of Aachen, of course. But Tourneux here is almost as long as Saint-Hilaire was, and it's not especially large at all as Romanesque churches go. The abbey at Cluny, we'll eventually see, was over 500 feet long. Another thing that distinguishes the Romanesque from the Carolingian is the use of sculptured decoration. There are no Carolingian churches with significant sculptural decoration. Tourneux doesn't have much, but it has more figures than all the Carolingian churches combined. You're looking at the north facade tower here at Tourneux, and you may just be able to make out the figures. There are only a few of them, but within a little over a century there will be hundreds on such churches. Here you see the facade of Tourneux now. The one thing that is always said to distinguish the Romanesque style, that is the Roman-like style, is the round arch, used so much in late classical architecture. But that feature doesn't distinguish the Romanesque from the Carolingian style, because almost all Carolingian churches have round arches also. It is typical of Romanesque churches to have round arches, but many have at least bluntly pointed ones, as we'll see, so it's not a defining feature of the style by any means. Terms like Romanesque and Gothic and Renaissance are, I suppose it goes without saying, impossible to define precisely. These terms have a lot in common with terms like the Bay Area or the Midwest. They're vague, but not infinitely so. Is Stockton in the Bay Area? Some would say yes, some scoff no, but no one says Los Angeles is in the Bay Area. The term isn't that vague. Here's the vault at Tourneux. Barrel vaults, which run the length of the nave, are common in Romanesque churches, but here the barrels, as it were, go across the nave. This is the only church I know of with this arrangement. But one of the things which, in fact, distinguishes the Romanesque style, one might say, is just the variety of feature one finds in it. At the left in this picture, you can see what are called groin vaults over the aisle too. Groin vaults are formed by the intersection of two barrel vaults and produce a sort of tent-like look. As we'll hear later, some argue that the key feature that distinguishes the Gothic from the Romanesque is just the addition of ribs to the joints of the groin vault to accentuate the tent-like effect. This is the narthex at Tourneux now. A narthex is sort of an indoor porch, Those who hadn't been baptized but wanted to get a sort of free trial of the service could watch from here. Also, women were sometimes restricted to this porch, as were those who were undergoing penance that denied them the benefit of actual church attendance. We're going to hear another hymn, Veni Creator Spiritus, now, which is, like the hymn Iste Confessor we heard before the break, often attributed to Rabanus Maurus. It was sung at the coronations of French kings from at least the late Middle Ages on. And while we do this, we'll see some more of the Abbey of Saint Philibert, the former Benedictine Abbey of Saint Philibert at Tournus. The narthex here has an upper floor from which one can also look down into the church through the windows at the right. Now you're looking east in the nave. The east end does have small windows where Carolingian churches rarely had any windows at all. You're looking back toward the entrance now, and you get a good look at the groined vault in the aisle here, and up above are those windows from the narthex into the nave. This is a view straight down the north aisle. Well, we've brought France up to the 11th century, and now we're going to cross over into Germany and see about Charlemagne's successors there. You may remember that Louis the German, who was the grandson of Charlemagne, got Germany by the Treaty of Verdun in 843. When his last direct descendant, Louis the Child, died in 911, the German nobility elected Conrad, Duke of Franconia, as the new king, and on his death without a son, Henry the Fowler, as he is called, who was Duke of Saxony and the soi-disant descendant of Witikind, who had given Charlemagne so much trouble, was elected. The title of Duke, incidentally, comes from the Latin dux, meaning leader. The German equivalent is Herzog. Henry the Fowler's son was Otto I, known as the Great, who was crowned king of Germany at Aachen in 936. Like Charlemagne, the dynasty to which he belonged was founded by his father, but named after him. It's the Ottonian dynasty, sometimes called the Saxon dynasty. By 950, he had brought all of Germany under his control and assigned the duchies you see on this map to relatives thought trustworthy. The next year he was also crowned King of Italy, tradition says, with the so-called iron nail crown which you see here in the Monza Cathedral treasury. The iron band around the inside is said to have been fashioned from a nail taken from the cross. This is also said to have been used to crown Charlemagne, and recent investigation suggests it's at least as old as his day. In 955, Otto defeated the Magyars from Hungary at the Lechfeld near Augsburg. This is a helmet in the German National Museum in Nuremberg, which is from his day and probably at least is of the sort suitable for him. It's made of an amalgam of silver and gold. That's called electrum. After his defeat of the Magyars, all of Central Europe was under Otto's control, and in 962 he went to Rome to be crowned by the Pope. Many of his predecessors had claimed the title Roman Emperor, but few, if any, had actually been crowned by the Pope in the fashion of Charlemagne in Rome. The actual regalia made for the coronation of Otto I still survive in the Vienna Art History Museum, and they were used for almost all other imperial coronations until the end of the empire. As I mentioned earlier, despite the coronation of Charlemagne by the Pope back in 800, the Holy Roman Empire, properly so called, is usually said to begin, at least symbolically, with Otto's crowning by Pope John XII. Unfortunately, John was no very good role model as a pope himself. In fact, in the 10th century, at least 8 popes were assassinated, several by their successors. John himself had been elected at the age of 18 on the demand of his father, the Duke of Spoleto, who was threatening to kill all the cardinals otherwise. After Otto left, John offered the crown to another emperor for a price. He would have crowned anyone for a new Ferrari. And for this he was deposed by Otto and replaced by Leo VIII, who was not even a priest at the time and does not even appear in most lists of official popes. For all of his unworthiness, John did set an important precedent, however. He changed his name from Ottaviano to John when he took office, and that set a precedent for such a change of names that has been followed by almost all popes since. This plaque is one of the Magdeburg ivories in the New York Metropolitan Museum. It was once part of the decoration of the Cathedra of the Archbishop of Magdeburg. On it you can see Otto at the lower left presenting the Cathedral of Magdeburg, which he founded, to Christ. On the right is St. Peter with his keys, but without a halo, which, if he's representing the papacy in the 10th century, doesn't seem inappropriate. In fact, he's without one, I think, simply because it would cover the faces of the saints behind him. Despite the fact that, as I said, the 10th century is the darkest of the dark ages, some fine things do survive, like this. And the Garo crucifix now, which you can still see in the Cathedral of Cologne, is often singled out as an almost one-of-a-kind work of art. It is perhaps what we should call the first Western or European, as opposed to classical, monumental, if not quite freestanding, sculpture. And it is also, I think, the earliest surviving example anywhere of a life-size sculpture of Christ on the cross. An image that, as I've said, was not popular in the early history of the Church. Certainly not in life-size rendition like this, anyway. It was apparently commissioned by Archbishop Garo of Cologne, although there were several important Garos around at this time, including the emperor's brother, but the name of the artist is unknown. This 10th century work is in fact much more realistic than many much later life-size painted crucifixions of the 13th and 14th centuries. In an argumentative frame of mind, one might even claim that this Corpus Domini is a foreshadowing of the emphasis placed on Christ's human suffering in German images of this subject in the Renaissance, and that this sort of representation is in some sense perhaps even connected to the old Germanic Arian heresy which we heard about, according to which Jesus was a human being distinct from God. In the East, the so-called Monophysite heresy held the opposite view, that Jesus was divine and not human at all. And although, like Arianism, this heresy also disappeared, one could argue that there was nevertheless something basic in the Byzantine view that found the emphasis on Christ's human suffering distasteful, and life-size figures of the crucifixion never did become popular in the East. As late as 1300, when the famous Kora Monastery Church in Istanbul was decorated, the Passion was, as at San Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna, left out altogether, and the emphasis is on Christ's miracles, that is, on his divinity. Before the break, I mentioned that the area around Lake Constance was one of the most artistically productive in this era. And this is the Church of St. George in the town of Obertzell on the island of Reichenau in the lake. Reichenau became an important place during the tenure of its most famous abbot, Walfrid Strabo, in the days of Charles the Bald. A pupil of Rabanus Maurus at Fulda, he wrote on things as diverse as liturgical practice and gardening. He also wrote of a vision he had of heaven and hell that bears a resemblance to the Divine Comedy, although Dante probably never saw it. As it stands, this church was built around 900 and has the most extensive fresco decoration surviving from any Carolingian or Ottonian building. Although these pictures, like the one of the flight to Egypt we saw in Münster, seem crude compared to the frescoes of the Renaissance, it's important to remember that the purpose of most medieval art of this kind was not to try to show us what, say, biblical events might actually have looked like. The purpose was rather to remind us that these events took place in a memorable way. Despite the fact that these are paintings, they are in a way more didactic than pictorial, I think. Here's Christ now calming the storm on the Sea of Galilee. This is almost something more like a hieroglyphic representing the event than a picture of what it might have really been like. Still, there's little doubt that the artist was no Michelangelo. There is a school of thought, one might call it the everything is beautiful in its own way school, which holds that every age and place produces its own genius, its own form of expression, and ultimately none is any greater than any other. However, I think most people who hold this view are of the opinion that if it's hard to put differences into words, then the differences don't exist, or else they're unable, because of their own extremely ordinary accomplishments, to imagine that there may be other people capable of things which are extremely far above what they can do, far above the ordinary. In the Cluny Museum in Paris, you can see this little ivory work which has Otto the Great's son Otto II on it at the left and his wife Theophano at the right. Otto had big plans for his son here. The idea was that Otto II and Theophano, who was the daughter of the Eastern Roman Emperor Romanus II, would themselves have a son who would be heir to both the Western and Eastern Roman empires. The grandson of Otto I, Otto the Great, would inherit both the East and the West. Even given the most propitious imaginable set of circumstances, this plan must have looked doomed to any objective observer of the time, I think, though. Otto II and Theophano did have a son, Otto III, but Otto II died shortly before his son's 4th birthday, and nothing came of the hoped-for reunion of East and West. The crown of the Golden Madonna, which you see here in the Essen Cathedral treasury, is thought to have been used at the coronation of Otto III. It's small, about the size suitable for a 4-year-old head or so, but it was apparently used by some later kings of Germany at their coronations as well. Under the regency of his mother, Otto III was very well educated by Bernward of Hildesheim, about whom more later, and the famous Gerbert of Aurillac, or Gerbert de Reims, the Archbishop of Reims. Had Otto III lived a normal length of life, he might have made quite an impact on the course of European civilization, but he was to die at just 22. And even so, he's one of the more interesting medieval rulers. His tutor Gerbert is himself among the real standout figures of the age too. Born in Aurillac, but educated at the monastery of Ripoll in Spain, he eventually became the tutor of Otto III's father, Otto II, and a trusted advisor as well to Hugh Capet, whose election as King of France he helped secure in 987. This is the Golden Madonna herself now in the Essen treasury. This is usually called the earliest surviving sculpture of the Madonna, and it was made around 990 or so for Abbess Matilda of the convent of St. Mary Cosmas and Damian in Essen, where the cathedral is now. She was a member of the imperial family. Again, there isn't that much surviving from the 10th century. Most of the surviving objets d'art would probably fit in my house. But this and the Garo crucifix are certainly important things in the history of Christian iconography. The crown we just saw was displayed on the head of this Madonna for centuries, but as I said, it was probably actually made for the coronation of Otto III, or at least for some other purpose than to be this Madonna's crown. Gerbert, who first met Otto III when the latter was just 16, was interested in everything. He made a famous mechanical clock. He studied the astrolabe and astronomy. He was an accomplished musician. But his most celebrated accomplishments were in logic and mathematics. He's in fact given credit by some for introducing the Arabic number system, about which he'd learned in Spain, to Western Europe, although the 12th century Italian Leonardo of Pisa, or Fibonacci as he's called, is usually given credit for that, or at least for making its use widespread. Gerbert was also a classicist and helped inspire his pupil with such a respect for Roman antiquity that in 998 Otto III went to Rome to live in emulation of the Caesars and to attempt the restoration of the greatness of their empire. Here's Otto III himself in the gospel book that bears his name in the Condé Library at Chantilly. He's posing as Roman emperor, but he looks a little bit like the captain of the imperial bowling team. The figures beside him are actually carrying orbs that represent the various parts of his claimed territory. The story of his Roman adventure is a complex one. Simply put, it went sort of like this. The Romans had gotten used to the idea that some German guy would come down to be crowned Roman emperor and then go home. But Otto built a palace on the Aventine Hill and proposed, as I said, to take his title a little more seriously. A revolt against him was led by a Roman patrician named Crescentius, whom Otto executed after storming his refuge in Hadrian's tomb, by then the Castle San Angelo. In 999, Pope Gregory V then conveniently died, allowing Otto to put his friend Gerbert on the throne of St. Peter as Sylvester II. More according to legend than history, Otto made Stephania, the widow of Crescentius, his unwilling concubine, and she poisoned him in the year 1002. And she is also popularly given credit for poisoning the Pope, his friend Gerbert, as well. In any case, Gerbert died the next year, Pope Sylvester II, bringing down with one woman's vengeance the whole projected new order of things. This is the Cross of Theophano, another donation to the monastery at Essen, favored by the imperial family, and it's in the cathedral treasury there now. Now the Cathedral of Essen treasury. This was probably donated not by the Theophano who is the wife of Otto II, but rather by one of several later Theophanos named after her, perhaps her niece. It has a carnelian in the center. We're going to see some of the other surviving Ottonian objets d'art now, and hear a piece of music that is sometimes said to be the earliest piece of at least post-classical secular music surviving. It's called the Song of the Sibyl, and it's about the prophecy revealed to Augustus by the Tiburtine Sibyl to the effect that a savior of mankind would be born in his reign. As I've mentioned earlier, this was looked upon as a sort of pagan and classical equivalent to the Annunciation, and helped justify the Church's interest in classicism generally. The earliest surviving text of this musical setting of the story, the Song of the Sibyl, is 10th century and apparently came from Spain. Gerbert might have heard it when he was there. This is the Echternach Gospel, donated by Otto III to the famous monastery there, founded by St. Willibrord. It probably comes from Reichenau, where the Church of St. George is that we saw earlier. It's now in the Nuremberg National Museum. This is a page from it on which you can see St. Luke. I think of the Ottonian style as the bug-eyed style. Eyes are typically rendered as though lidless. This is a page from another gospel book that belonged to Otto III. It's now in the Staatsbibliothek in Munich. the cover of that book. It was made at the monastery at Reichenau, on the island of Reichenau, but the ivory Assumption was made in Byzantium. The soul of the Virgin is represented here as a newborn babe being passed up to heaven. This ivory St. Paul in the Cluny Museum was made for some lost Etonian book. St. Paul as he appears here has always looked sort of like some Chinese philosopher to me, like Confucius or Lao Tzu. And this is the famous Lothair cross, which was actually made for Otto III and is now in the Aachen Cathedral treasury. It is certainly one of the most splendid surviving works of medieval craftsmanship. And here you see Augustus, as in the Song of the Sibyl, represented in effect as an honorary Christian, and representing as well the connection between the empire and the church. On the back, however, there is this very different representation. Here there is no allusion to worldly splendor or power, but rather a spare and simple representation of the Savior whose coming was, from the medieval Christian perspective, foretold to Augustus. After the untimely death of Otto III in 1002, his second cousin, Henry, the Duke of Bavaria, was chosen to succeed him as King of Germany, though he wasn't crowned emperor by the Pope until 1014. On this page, he is represented as though being presented with the crown by the Lord himself. Henry II, only 19 himself at his coronation, is the only emperor to have been canonized, although he doesn't really seem to have been a much better candidate for this honor than any other emperor. The thing that stood out, though, in the minds of his early biographers was the fact that when they were crowned, he and his wife Kunigunde took vows of chastity. I guess it was thought only a saint could live up to that. And Jacobus de Voragine, in his famous compilation of the lives of the saints, about which we'll hear much more in the future, the Golden Legend it's called, says that Henry did once suspect Kunigunde of infidelity, so he made her walk over white-hot plowshares to prove her innocence. The theory being that the Lord would protect her feet if she were innocent, and in fact she emerged unscathed. This is the crown of Kunigunde, now in the Munich residence treasury. It was probably made at Fulda. Well, Henry is supposed to have said he was sorry about his suspicions, but come Judgment Day, when he showed up at the pearly gates, and St. Michael was standing by St. Peter to weigh the good and the bad in his life, there were those iron plowshares weighing down the balance to the ground. However, just as St. Peter was about to bar the way and push the down button, along came St. Lawrence. I've always figured paradise is sort of like Hollywood, where you see big stars on every street corner. In any case, Lawrence had with him a big golden bowl which Henry had given to a church that had been dedicated to him. And seeing Henry's plight, Lawrence tossed the golden bowl into the other side of that balance. It outweighed the plowshares and Henry was saved. I'm not sure, however, that we can draw a very edifying moral from this story. It sounds a bit like it would be money talks. We're going to hear a version of another piece from the Benedict Beuern manuscripts, the Carmina Burana, which, as I mentioned last time, is one of the largest collections of medieval secular music. Some 130 songs, and some with some music going back to perhaps the 11th century, as early as that. And while we hear this, we'll see some of the fine things made for Henry and Kunigunde in the early 11th century. This is the Basel altarpiece, now in the Cluny Museum in Paris, although it was originally made for the Benedictine monastery in Bamberg, favored by Henry. It is also thought to have been made at either Reichenau or Fulda. Jesus is seen here with Saint Benedict at the left and three archangels. In this detail, you can see Henry and Kunigunde kneeling at the feet of Jesus. They also donated the Aachen altarpiece to the cathedral there, where it is still to be found. This was made at Fulda. Here's the Last Supper from this altarpiece. The pulpit at Aachen, which you see now, was also a gift from them. This is the ivory cover of Henry's Book of Pericopes. Pericopes are favorite spiritual passages. This was made at Reichenau. This is Kunigunde's jewel box in the Bavarian National Museum in Munich. And Henry's reliquary for his piece of the True Cross. This was made at Fulda and is now in the Bamberg Cathedral treasury. And also in the Bamberg Cathedral treasury is this mantle that belonged to Kunigunde. Events from Advent and Christmas are embroidered onto it with fine gold wire. And this is a close-up of Henry's mantle, also preserved there. Here Jesus is represented with Mary and John the Baptist, and also between the sun and moon, and surrounded by the symbols of the zodiac, in a way reminiscent of the robes said to have been worn by Roman emperors in antiquity, and foreshadowing the use of these symbols in the decoration of Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals. This is the Church of St. Michael at Hildesheim, the foundation stone of which was laid by Bernward, the great scholar and abbot of the monastery here at the time. He was, like Gerbert, a tutor of the precocious Otto III, and also of his successor, Henry II, about whom we've been hearing. This church could be said to stand to German Romanesque architecture the way Tournus stands to French Romanesque, and it was begun just a few years later, maybe around 1010. St. Michael's does, however, exhibit important differences. It has, for example, a choir and transept at each end of the church, and the entrance is at the side. And this arrangement is rare outside Germany. So when you enter the church, instead of looking down the nave, you look across the transept gallery to the north, and then you have to turn to the east to face the altar. And here's the nave now, looking east. We haven't seen a lot of Western European churches yet with which to compare this, but unlike the late Roman-style Christian basilicas, St. Paul outside the walls, Santa Maria Maggiore, Santa Apollinare in Classe, there is not a uniform colonnade separating the nave from the aisle. The nave arcade, as it is called, is here made up of a sort of AAB arrangement. 2 columns then appear, 2 columns then appear. Although this arrangement itself doesn't become common, it foreshadows the division of the church into what will be called bays in the future. The painted wooden roof, restored after World War II, is 13th century. The nave is over 30 feet wide, and it was probably thought just too wide to attempt to vault it in stone in Bernward's day. The striation, which is often supposed to be somehow Moorish, is found in a lot of Romanesque buildings all over Europe. It may, I suppose, in fact be ultimately Moorish, but this is a difficult question to resolve. Bernward, who was likely the architect of the church itself, was also the sculptor as well as the man who apparently actually cast the great bronze doors to the church, which are now at the Cathedral of St. Mary's in Hildesheim, for which some think they were originally made. There are also copies of them in the Nuremberg National Museum. Old Testament scenes are to the left, New Testament to the right. These are the oldest such historiated doors in existence, although the undecorated bronze doors of the Temple of Romulus in the Forum are of course much older. These are the direct ancestors of Ghiberti's Gates of Paradise we'll see next quarter. This is the Adam and Eve panel up close, and here you have a very clear example of buck passing. The Lord points at Adam in blame, Adam points at Eve, and Eve says it was all the snake's fault. This is also a rare example of a signed work of art from the Middle Ages, and it is in fact usually said to be the earliest work of art to be both signed and dated, in the much abbreviated style of writing popular in the Middle Ages. This says, "In the year of the Lord, MXV 1015, Bernward for the glory of God cast these doors." In this section, viewed bottom to top like the images in a stained glass window, we see the Annunciation, the Nativity, and the Adoration of the Magi. Because of Henry II's vow of chastity, the Saxon or Ottonian line ended with him, and the so-called Franconian or Salian line then took over with the election of Conrad II, a descendant of old Otto I the Great in the female line, by the nobility. We'll hear a bit more about Conrad and his son Henry III in later discussion of German Romanesque churches, but Henry III's son Henry IV deserves special attention. This is the castle of Canossa, west of Modena in northern Italy, where one of the most famous events of the age took place in January 1077. The Ottonian and Franconian emperors had pretty much arrogated to themselves the right to appoint bishops in Germany, and on several occasions had enthroned or deposed even the bishops of Rome themselves. Here you see another view of the ruins of the castle at Canossa. When Gregory VII, who is often also called by his given name Hildebrand, became pope in 1073, he vowed to put a stop to this practice of lay investiture, as it was called, and he also attacked simony, the practice of selling church offices, and Nicolaitism, clerical marriage. When the Emperor Henry IV refused to go along with all this, Gregory excommunicated him. The only other precedent for the excommunication of a ruler was Gregory V's excommunication of the French king Robert II, the son of Hugh Capet, and that was a papal victory. Henry IV, too, was forced by his state of outlawry from the church to come to Canossa here to meet with Gregory and sort things out. The castle was owned at the time by the famous Matilda, Countess of Tuscany, about whom a lot more could be said, and you see her here presiding over the meeting between Pope and Emperor which took place in her castle. Gregory made Henry wait outside in the snow for 3 days in January 1077 before finally letting him in and absolving him. This was, like St. Ambrose' humbling of Theodosius, a great but transitory victory for the church. Henry went back to Germany, restored to the Christian fold, but at Canossa he'd been an actor with a political motive rather than a true suppliant with a spiritual motive, and he promptly began maneuvering to get rid of Gregory. This is the last view of Canossa. In 1080, the excommunication was renewed with less effect, and what amounts to war broke out between the forces supporting the Pope and those supporting the Emperor Henry. In 1084, Henry took the city, while Gregory took refuge in the castle San Angelo. Robert Guiscard and his Normans from southern Italy, we'll hear more about them eventually, arrived to rescue the Pope, but in the ensuing battle, much of the city was wrecked, and Gregory died in exile at Salerno. Okay, next time we'll hear about England, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the 11th century, King Arthur, Alfred the Great, the Book of Kells. There'll be a lot to see.